You are listening to American Ambassadors Live, the podcast on international affairs sponsored by the Council of American Ambassadors in Washington, D.C. The Council is the association of non-career U.S. ambassadors who have represented America under presidents from John F. Kennedy through Donald Trump.
Our guest today is Joseph Cirincione, a nuclear security expert for the past 40 years. He served on the International Security Advisory Board for Secretaries of State Hillary Clinton and John Kerry, and is the author of 7 books, including Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It's Too Late. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Jim.
For months, as Vladimir Putin has been waging war in Ukraine, he and his people have been implying that in some way, at some point, they might use nuclear weapons. You've obviously followed both the technology and the politics of nuclear weapons for your entire career. What is your judgment of the likelihood that Putin will, in fact, use nuclear weapons in the war in Ukraine?
The risks are very real. I think it's almost impossible to put a percentage term on this. It's not a mathematical equation. A lot depends on the mood, the attitude of President Putin, so that's very difficult to calculate. But in some ways, it doesn't matter. If the risks are 5% or 50%, you still have to do the same things. You have to do everything you can to prevent him from using these weapons, trying to deter him from taking this action, and also prepare your responses for what you want to do should he cross the nuclear line. I will say this, we're recording this in October, which is the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the U.S. and the Soviet Union came face to face over 10 tense days in October. This has unfolded over 7 months, but it is equally risky. We are the highest level of intentional use of nuclear weapons than we have been at any time since those fretful days in 1962.
How is it different than 1962 in terms of the technology, in terms of the impact?
Well, the weapons are better. They're more accurate. They're less plentiful. Actually, U.S. and Soviet, Russian arsenals are lower than they were in the 1960s, thanks to decades of arms control agreements. But what we're talking about now is not a global thermonuclear war. And that's the image many people still might have. Everything goes at once in one big thermonuclear spasm. But we're talking about the use of perhaps a weapon or a few weapons in a battlefield. So we're talking about what some call tactical nuclear weapons, meaning shorter ranges, not spanning the oceans, but impacting in Ukraine, perhaps the surrounding countries, and of relatively low yield. So if you're going to use a weapon in a battlefield on which you're fighting, you don't need a 500 kiloton device or 100 kiloton device. Something Hiroshima size or smaller might serve your purposes. So those are the main differences. I'd say the way to look at the risk is that Putin is playing a very dangerous game here. He's got the weapons he needs to implement this war. He's got about 2,000 so-called tactical nuclear weapons he can draw on. He has a methodology for using them. It's in official Russian doctrine that they will use a nuclear weapon first in a conventional battle in order to turn the tidal battle in their favor. And finally, he has the motive. He's losing this war. In fact, it's very hard to see how he even stabilizes the situation at this point, let alone goes on to win this invasion of Ukraine. So he has the means, he has the methodology, he's got the motivation. That's why the risks are so high.
What are the advantages of using these smaller scale nuclear weapons in a battlefield situation in Ukraine compared to using conventional weapons? Obviously, saying you might do it scares the bejesus out of people, but leaving aside sort of the psychological impact, what is the actual military value?
Right. Well, that's actually the first value. Threatening to do it stays your hand. I mean, if Putin didn't have nuclear weapons, we would be involved in the Ukraine war right now. The only thing that is keeping the United States out is the fear of, as President Biden says, turning this into World War III. So in this case, nuclear weapons are a deterrent, all right. They're a deterrent from us coming to the aid of Ukraine to repel the invasion. But on the military side, there really aren't many military advantages. These complicate the battlefields, but particularly if you're going to use them on terrain that you plan to conquer. Now it's radioactive terrain. Now there's vast destruction on that terrain. There are numerous responses to nuclear use, many of which can be worse than what you were hoping to deter by your use. The main value is shock value. And that's what you're going for. And that's what the Russians talk about in their doctrine. Some call it escalate to de-escalate. If you're losing a conventional battle, you want to use a nuclear weapon to escalate to the war, to show that you're serious, that the stakes are existential for you, and you want your adversary to back off to prevent, so that you won't use further nuclear weapons. And that has an advantage. That's the shock of seeing a nuclear weapon used in this context. We haven't seen one in 77 years. We haven't even seen an above-ground nuclear explosion since countries stopped atmospheric testing in 1980. Was the last atmospheric test. So this would definitely be a shocking event, and that's the main advantage for Putin at this point, to try to use it to shock the adversary into ceasing their advance and perhaps surrendering, realizing that they can't win a nuclear war with Russia.
Let's talk a little bit more about radioactivity, because that's one of the things that most people fear about nuclear weapons. So let's say they use one of these smaller weapons in Ukraine. They blow up a lot of things, like conventional weapons can blow up a lot of things and kill a lot of people. But what's the difference on the radioactivity side? What are the dangers to whom over what period of time if they use one of these tactical nuclear weapons?
Right. So let's say they use the Iskander, which has been used extensively in conventional mode in the war so far. The Iskander is a ground-launched cruise missile. It's designed to be fitted with a nuclear warhead. So in storage, Russia has nuclear warheads that they can put on the Iskander. We'd probably see them doing this, not for certain, but probably see the movement of these warheads, and we haven't detected anything like this so far. That has a yield of between 10 and 100 kilotons. So the Hiroshima bomb was 15 kilotons, 15,000 tons of TNT. Let's say he used a 10 kiloton yield, slightly smaller, so a Hiroshima-type explosion. Number one, there's an enormous economy of explosive power here. So we're talking about one bomb delivered on one missile that's the equivalent of 20,000 of our conventional bombs. We have 1,000-pound bombs. So that'd be the equivalent of 10 tons, 20,000, 1,000 tons. That gives you just a frame for what to consider, why someone would consider using this. The other is the thermal heat. Unlike conventional weapons, nuclear weapons give enormous heat, and the fireball from a blast that size would be about a half mile in diameter. That's the fireball. And it would set off a megastorm, burning up, and the great damage from that. But then there's the radiation. Interestingly, for a nuclear weapon, the radiation is intense. If you're within about a mile radius of that blast, you get fatal dose of radiation. So you're dead, not from the heat or the blast, which you'd also be killed from, but also the radiation. So an underground doesn't really save you at that point. It's relatively short-lasting, though. People were walking on Hiroshima and Nagasaki days after the event. The intense radiation has a very short half-life. The longer-term radiation will be there for weeks. It'll still be a health hazard, but it won't kill you right away. And then there's a radiation plume. A weapon of that size used on a city like Kherson, for example, would drift all the way up the eastern border of Ukraine and probably spill over into Russia, but that's probably it. It isn't something that you would feel or be able to detect if you were in Kyiv even, or Warsaw or Paris or New York, and except for trace amounts of radioactivity you'd pick up days later in atmospheric sampling.
Okay, thank you. So now let's talk about the possible scenarios, how this might happen in Ukraine. How do you see that?
Well, I recently wrote an article for the Washington Post, sort of going through this. It's been something I've been talking about. How exactly would these happen? And we are guided by Russian military writings on this, where they discuss these various options. And the very first option is a demonstration shot. So you use a nuclear weapon of whatever yield you want. It could be quite large. And you explode it over, say, an uninhabited region like the Black Sea off the coast of Ukraine. There'd be no damage. No one would die from this. You'd have radiation that'd be drifting in the atmosphere, as we talked about, but nothing would happen. It would be purely for shock value, purely to signal your intent. And again, the Russians talk about this. In that case, in fact, some of the scientists associated with the Manhattan Project in 1945 wrote a report to President Truman recommending just such a demonstration shot against Japan instead of bombing the cities. And the U.S. military rejected that option, probably for the same reason that Putin would reject it. As shocking as it would be, it's not shocking enough. It would stop the world in its tracks. As I say, we haven't seen such a thing in many decades. That's all we'd be talking about. But there wouldn't be any damage on the field of battle, and so it's probably not a sufficient move for Putin at this point. So the second scenario, what would be more dramatic? What would produce the shock that he's looking for? Well, you could use a small or low yield, say Hiroshima size, say 10 kilotons, 15 kilotons, on a military target in Ukraine. Again, the damage would be localized, but it would be intense. You would stop an advancing Ukrainian offensive, which are on the march right now in the north and the southeast of Ukraine. You would stop them in their tracks. If you used it on a city like Kherson, you'd be demonstrating that liberating a city like Kherson is not going to save it. You will destroy what the Ukrainians have liberated. There would be thousands would die, tens of thousands would be injured. There'd be substantial damage. And at that point, you would start to see a massive U.S., NATO, and probably global response to that. And we can get into that in a little later. But you might decide that that isn't enough, that what you really want to do is use a very large yield weapon, so something still in the tactical range.
By you, you mean Putin and the Russians.
Putin, right. When you're thinking about this, and there is logic about this. We game out these scenarios. We have a first use doctrine. We have all kinds of scenarios that we game out about how we would use this in a battle for the same reasons that Putin is thinking. How do you turn the battle to your advantage? So you're gaming this out and you're pretending to be rational about this. And you would use a 50 kiloton device, a very large device, massive destruction, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands killed, depending on what the target is. Intense radiation at that point, definitely a game changer, definitely showing that you are willing to do anything except lose. And the fourth and the most severe strategy would be using this against a NATO target. And again, the Russians talk about this in the strategy that we've termed escalate to de-escalate. Some U.S. military commanders say it's better to call it escalate to win, because that's what they're trying to do. And you would use it against a transportation node in Poland, for example, or maybe even a target in Central or Western Europe. That would be the most dangerous move for Putin, the most one likely to provoke not just an economic, diplomatic, political, and conventional military response, but there'd be huge pressure for NATO and the United States to respond with a nuclear weapon of its own. And then you're in the risky game of trying to control the escalation. Who's got the last move? And in war games, unfortunately, it's not at all clear how you terminate a nuclear conflict once it starts.
You mentioned earlier how many nuclear warheads they have, and they're fewer than there were 40 years ago or 42 years ago. We have fewer as well. Give us some sense, though, of the supply of nuclear weapons from the point of view of strategy and a counter strategy. Do both sides basically have enough nuclear weapons that they don't have a supply constraint
Oh no, oh no, they have more than enough. There's
Got it,
there's
got it.
no there's no problem here. I mean, you know, it's estimated that if a nuclear war happened with just 100 nuclear weapons, just 100 going off, it would put enough particulates and pollutants into the atmosphere to enshroud the Earth in a cloud for 2 or 3 years, dropping global temperatures 2 or 3 degrees. And before you think that's a answer to global warming, that would mean that you would lose about 40% of the food crops for all those years. They couldn't grow under those conditions, and you'd have mass famine. That's just 100. The U.S. and Russia have both about 5,000 weapons. Russia actually closer to 6,000 in their total arsenals. They're the only ones like that. All the other countries, there are 9 countries with nuclear weapons, they have arsenals in the hundreds, ranging from a couple of dozen to North Korea to France that has 350 for some reason. But nobody else has seen the need to go up to the thousands. This is still a hangover from our Cold War strategies that Putin still has a stockpile that big. So there's more than enough for anything you want to do.
So does that basically mean that all the efforts over all those years to reduce stockpiles really didn't make any difference?
No, they did make a difference.
How so?
I mean, there used to be 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world. We're down to a global total of under 13,000 at this point. So there was sharp reductions, even before the Cold War. Reagan, Gorbachev, right? Sharp reductions. And Reagan and Gorbachev started this during the Cold War.
Right.
Remember, they failed in their meeting at Reykjavik to eliminate them altogether, but they spawned at least 2 arms control agreements that dramatically reduced, and we kept reducing them all the way down, and then we stopped. And this is, when we get out of this situation, if we get out of this, we have to go back and look again at those efforts to reduce and move towards the elimination of these weapons. The last major arms control treaty was in 2010, the New START treaty, and there haven't been any serious negotiations since then. There are none anywhere. None of the nuclear powers are seriously talking about restraining their arsenals. And in fact, what you hear, particularly in the United States and in China and in Russia, is that the need to build more, to go up.
Here's my question. If we did all these reductions and everybody has enough to have these cataclysmic effects, what's the value of the reductions? If you get to 0, I get it. But unless you get to 0, if everybody still has 100, and you say 100 is enough to do big damage, what's the value of the arms reduction?
What's the value of the arms reduction? Because the goal is to keep going. So there was, when Reagan and Gorbachev met in Reykjavik, they wanted to eliminate them all at once, and they couldn't quite do it, right? And people were askance at that. Whether it was Sam Nunn or Richard Pearl, they all thought that was a terrible idea. In hindsight, we should have done it. But what they did embrace was gradual reductions. So you reduce and you keep your security and make sure you're not going to be caught by surprise. No one's going to get an edge on you. The problem is that stopped. And we're at these levels now, and there's no further reductions. And as I say, instead of continuing that slide, we've leveled off, and now it looks like the pressure's to tick it up. So that's the benefit, was that this was a gradual road towards elimination. That strategy worked in the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s. It's not working now. And that's why you see many countries around the world pressing once again for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. There's over 60 countries that have ratified a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. None of the nuclear weapon states have done that, but you're seeing pressure build in other countries to get back on the path of elimination. As I say, even when you look at this level, a small war in Ukraine relative by global standards, using one nuclear weapon, it's still very tricky business. There's no real military utility to it. So why do you need them at all?
I get that argument, but I guess what I want to push back on and get your reaction to, if you get to 0, it's clear what the value that is to everybody.
Yeah.
But if the arsenals that the Russia and the United States have now, and the arsenals that you say France has 300 and et cetera, what's the value of increasing supplies? If you have enough.
Increasing. I'm sorry. That's the flip side of it. What you hear arguments, for example, Frank Miller is one of the more prominent former Pentagon officials arguing for this. And this gets you into the weird world of nuclear strategy. You know, the Nobel Prize for Physics was just awarded for work on quantum physics, which is a very strange world when you get down to, you know, particle and subparticle. The same is true for nuclear. It gets very weird in there. And what they argue is that you need weapons to fill the gaps. So Russia has 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons. We have about 250, about 100 forward deployed, airdropped B-61 munitions stationed at 5 NATO bases. And they say, well, we have a gap. There's a tactical nuclear weapons gap. You know, we need more tactical nuclear weapons in order to deter Russia from using them. Or we need more usable nuclear weapons. That the nuclear weapons we have are too big. We need to have very small nuclear weapons. And in recent years, the U.S. has, in fact, under the Trump administration, started to deploy on our strategic submarines a new warhead, the W-76-2 warhead, that changes the yield from the W-76-1, you still with me here? From a very big hydrogen bomb with 100 kiloton yield to a very small atomic bomb with an 8 kiloton yield. Why? So you can use this on a conventional target. You can use your strategic submarine to engage in battlefield conditions. And that's what they argue. So there's arguments now and there's funding proposals before the Congress for a new sea-launched cruise missile with a warhead, a new ground-launched cruise missile. Some people want to put new nuclear weapons in space. You have all kinds of proposals for this. And of course, you know, we've built up a nuclear industrial complex over the years with contractors who are more than willing to give you new proposals to keep their production lines going. So you get an ideological, a military, and a contractor pressure in all the countries for building new, better, more usable weapons. That's the path we're on right now.
I understand. So let's talk about what do we do about, not the long term with the supply of nuclear weapons, but the short term with deterring Putin or responding to Putin.
So the U.S. games this out regularly, and they've been doing this for decades, and it's been intensified since the start of this war. We know this, that special teams have been set up, or I should say enhanced, because they're doing this all the time. And in this case, they're looking at the various scenarios, and we outlined 4, but there's dozens, you know, different variations. So you have to look at each one of them and just determining the response. And from what we can gather, the overwhelming preference of both the political and military leaders in our country is to have a non-nuclear response. We don't need to respond in kind, as they say. And that's why if it was a demonstration shot or a relatively low yield weapon used in Ukraine, you would immediately see the United States do several things. One is complete diplomatic isolation, which I think would be successful. Even
what does that mean exactly? What is complete diplomatic isolation? How does that work?
You get the world to condemn this. So people who've been sitting on the sidelines or who have abstained, for example, from the UN Security Council resolution recently condemning the annexation, you had China and India abstain from that resolution. Interestingly, not vote against it. You know, I think Russia was the only country to vote against it, but abstained. So they're trying to maintain. They would distance themselves from a country that had used a nuclear weapon. China and India both have no first use policies. They don't want to see a country breaking the nuclear taboo. So they would condemn it. This would be, now you've gone too far. You'd also see economic isolation. You think that the sanctions we put on Russia are severe, and they are, but they're still connected to the international banking system. That would end. People are still allowed to, or are still buying energy resources from, that would end. You know, you'd see them just completely like pain, immediate pain, and more to come. You know, more like that. It would you want to do everything you can to deter them from using any more nuclear weapons. There would also be, depending, you know, a conventional military response, starting with massive new arms shipments to Ukraine, but possibly, depending on what the scenario is, direct U.S. or NATO conventional military involvement in the war. You know, we've spent decades developing highly precise, very powerful conventional weapons. We don't need to use nuclear weapons to achieve many of the military missions we once had for nuclear weapons. We could probably devastate the Russian army in Ukraine in a matter of days with our conventional forces alone. So instead of winning the war, he would lose the war. And then there's cyber operations. We haven't seen much cyber in this war so far. We expected to see more, right?
Why do you think it is?
For all the talk about Russian cyber operations, and we still may yet see those, the U.S. has better cyber weapons. I mean, you thought Stuxnet was an interesting weapon to use to shut down the Iranian centrifuges and wreck them without the Iranian operators knowing about it. We could probably turn Russia dark. We could at least shut down key sectors with our cyber weapons alone, and a big target of that would be the military command and control. So you could see that happening, which we'd be in new territory then, things like that. And finally, psychological operations. I don't know if you remember, but the U.S. military placed phone calls to the homes of Iraqi generals in 2003 before we invaded. Personally called them and said, that they should stand down. And that phone call, first let the generals know we know where you live. Sure. We can reach out and touch you. And we want to remind you that there's a life after the war, if you choose it, And we have Dmitry Medvedev's cell phone number. We have Shoigu's, the Minister of Defense. We have his cell. We know where he is. And I think you want to let them know that and let them calculate their own personal stakes in this. So you'd see things like that, which is why our leaders are comfortable saying we don't have to respond with the nuclear. It's not that crude. It's not that direct. And the pressure you would get, and you see it's being debated somewhat in some of the media now, is that there are people, particularly those involved with U.S. nuclear weapons, either producing them or the service, like the Strategic Command, who believe that you have to restore nuclear deterrence. That's the phrase. So if they use nuclear weapons, in order to restore nuclear deterrence, we have to use one in return. We have to show that there's a nuclear price to pay. That argument isn't winning so far, but if there was a strike on a NATO country, I think that argument would prevail. It'd be a big debate, but I think you would see a nuclear response, and that's probably, or an attack on the United States, you would see a nuclear response. The reason you don't want to go there is because you don't have control over the last move. What sounds like it's a good argument, restore nuclear deterrence, might not work. Because Putin would say, well, I'm going to answer you back. I'm going to launch 5 nuclear weapons. What are you going to do then, chump? You feeling lucky? And that's the deterrence game. You think your move is going to force the other guy to stand down, but you don't get to decide that. You don't get the last move. And most of the war games that start off this way escalate into global thermonuclear war. Because as I say, there's no logical termination point. Like a poker player who's losing a hand, you keep thinking if you just raise the bet, the other side will back down. Will they?
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, you've laid out a very rational argument for what we should do, and we've seen the Biden administration, talk about how they're talking privately with the Russians about what might happen, and I presume that's true.
Yeah.
So I presume the Russians, I don't mean to imply that you're not the smartest guy in the room, but I presume you have.
I am not the sharpest knife in the drawer, not by a long.
Well, you obviously are incredibly expert on this, and it's so much.
I'm just eloquent.
You are that too, but the Russians must know what you know in a sense about this.
Yeah, that's right.
They think about this stuff too, and they're smart people. So the way you describe it sounds like there's really no incentive for him to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
Right. See, and that's why no one's used them for 77 years. Right, we've just walked through a particular instance, and as you look at the scenarios, you conclude what everyone has concluded up to this point for 77 years, when there have been numerous debates about using nuclear weapons in numerous countries, and nobody's done it for this exact reason, right? It's too risky. Can't control it. I won't win. Now, The problem is that all of this is based, all this game theory, all this deterrence theory is based on rational actors. Is Putin a rational actor? Is he making a cost-benefit analysis? We think he is. We think that the crazy statements he's making, that the West is an international conspiracy led by Satan worshippers, right? That the historic sacred role of Russia is to overthrow the global grip of these Satan-worshiping internationalists. We think that's rhetoric. Is it? You know, if he is crazier than we think, then we're toast, because he might be willing to bring the whole house down. He says there is no history of the world without Russia. What does he mean by that? What? Does he really mean Russia, or does he mean him, l'état et moi? You know, if he feels that his life, his power is at risk, that he can't lose, well, that kind of changes the equation, doesn't it? And he might be willing to take the risk because he'd rather be dead than defeated. That's the problem you have when you give one man the ability to launch nuclear weapons for whatever reason he wants, whatever he wants. And that's the situation in Russia. That's the situation in the United States. But the problem we have right now is with Russia. He's got the power. If he decided to launch, there'd be nothing to stop him. He doesn't need anybody's approval. There'd be nothing to stop him except an all-out mutiny of the general staff.
Well, that's where I was going to go with this. I mean, there's a good bit of history over many centuries of mutinies of general staffs and militaries pursuing their own interest. In this case, their own interest would be not destroying their own lives and their own country. Talk a little bit about that in terms of as people game out nuclear theory, where the boss says do it, but the folks who actually have to do it are like, I'm not doing it.
Well, you know, we actually have an example of this in 1983 when the U.S. was conducting these massive conventional NATO exercises called Able Archer. There was a mistake in the Russian early warning system, and they mistakenly thought that the U.S. during these exercises had launched a nuclear attack, which is one of the scenarios that they'd been training for. And they gave the order to do it. And one guy, a colonel, didn't believe the order. In other words, the general staff was telling him to launch the missiles, and this guy didn't believe it. So he just didn't do it. He didn't make a stance about it. He just didn't do it. And that bought enough time. In fact, the order came down twice. They thought there was 200 missiles, and then they came back and said, no, it's 2,000 missiles. And the guy said, no, that can't be right. And the time passed, and they corrected the error. But it came down to one guy. So you've seen this kind of scenario happen. In the case of Putin, you know, Russia is different now than it was then. And this is something we all have to come to grips with. And I don't think we really have understood this. This is not, as bad as the Soviet Union was, that was a collective leadership. One man did not have sole launch authority. We had a brief experience with democracy in Russia, you know, starting with Yeltsin. And we now are in what I would call a fascist government. I don't see anything different between a classic fascist government and what Putin has erected in both his cult of personality, his one-man rule, his control of the media, his control of the apparatus. He controls it in a way that no one has ever, possible exception of Stalin, controlled the Russia before. This is a different world out there now. These are a different set of risks. This is why, as you start to think this through in depth, it gets very frightening. You can't put a percentage term on this, as I said, but it is not zero. And when it's something when you have a low probability but high consequence event like nuclear war, you have to take this extremely seriously and be doing everything you can to prevent it from happening, because, as we've just discussed, the responses are fraught with difficulties. There is not a satisfying response. There are all these things you can do that you hope will work, but they all have escalatory potential. So the safest course is to do everything you can now to build up this global pressure, not just the U.S., not just NATO, but getting these countries on the sidelines to build up the pressure to convince Putin that there are other moves for him to make that could save him and his future, even as if he has to retreat from Ukraine.
It certainly seems like, from what we see publicly, that's exactly the strategy the Biden administration is pursuing.
I think that's exactly right. In fact, I think you got to give the Biden administration a lot of credit. They haven't made a lot of noise about this. The president's given a few speeches. He made some statements going a little farther than his staff wanted him to go on certain occasions. But in general, overall, he has responded like we would want them to respond. I'm a progressive. I'm a lifelong anti-war activist. And we don't desert people who've been attacked by fascist rulers. We go to their aid, and that's what you want your country to do, and that's what we've done. We are helping the Ukrainians fight this monster who is committing unbelievable acts of brutality, as bad as anything we've seen in decades, worse than anything we've seen. And yet he's doing it in a way that controls the escalation, that doesn't push Putin too far. So, for example, just one little issue, it's in the news currently. What kind of weapons do we give Ukraine? Well, we've drawn the line at ATACMS, weapons that can travel 280 miles. We've given them the HIMARS that can go 40, 50 miles, right? And that's really made a change in the battle. It's one of the reasons Ukrainians are advancing right now. But we're afraid that if we give them 300-mile range missiles, they will use them to attack some of the targets in Russia, which are the launch points for many of the missiles that are hitting them, because Russia has missiles that can go that far. They're doing it. They're using the Iskanders that can travel that far. And you don't want to provoke Putin. And so far that's worked. He's done this. He's given them lots of aid, rallied the world around them without bringing us to the brink of nuclear war. And now that you're at this point where Putin is losing, something that most people didn't think was possible 7 months ago, it is happening. He is losing the war. You got to manage this very, very carefully. And so far, I think they are. I think they're doing exactly the right thing. A little more, perhaps. I think they could lean a little more forward on diplomatic alternatives, keep offering to have talks. The problem you have right now is neither Putin or Ukraine want to talk. And I think that's understandable. The Ukrainians are having great success on the battlefield, and they want to press their advantage. But in the coming weeks, you can imagine that success halting unless the army collapses completely. And I think this Russian army is very fragile at this moment, and you could see a collapse. But short of that happening, you got to be preparing more diplomatic initiatives to go while you're doing everything you can to help the Ukrainian on the battlefield. Because my view, in the end, Putin is only going to be serious about peace talks when he is clear that he cannot win on the battlefield, even by nuclear escalation.
Well, we end where we began. We don't know how big the risk is, but there is a serious risk, and we need to take it seriously. Is that a fair statement?
That's absolutely fair. Do everything we can to prevent it from happening, because the responses are nowhere near satisfactory enough.
Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Jim, for having me.
This is Ambassador Jim Rosapepe for American Ambassadors Live podcast.
This has been the American Ambassadors Live podcast. To hear more from us, subscribe to the American Ambassadors Live podcast and leave us a review. Tweet us your thoughts on this week's episode and tag us at AMER Ambassadors using the hashtag AmbassadorsLive.